much easier than a lot of people in science seem to think. So, Benny, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. Yep, so that's right. I studied electronic engineering. When I graduated, I could only speak English, and I have kind of changed that in the last 20 or so years. So I'll talk a little bit about that today, and I look forward to any questions people have for me. I can't see the question myself, but I presume you'll pass them on to me when I get to that point. So this is the presentation I'll be given. Okay, the view is backwards, so I press a single button here and move myself over. Okay, so sorry about that. The preview gave me a different view. All right, so why languages are easier than you think, and I'm going to dive into a bunch of the excuses that I personally had when I got into language learning at first as an engineer. So of course, if you know who I am, look, this is me, same guy in the picture. So I have been traveling the world for almost 20 years. As you saw in the first image, I'm currently in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and everything I own in the world goes into one suitcase. I'm completely nomadic, and the theme of all of my travels for the last 19 years has been to learn the language wherever I go, even though I don't feel like I've ever had a natural talent for languages. So a few things I want to dive into. I know I've only got about 20 minutes, but I want to very quickly see what makes a language hard in a lot of people's minds, the personal roadblocks you have to let go of, how to look at a language to see the easy aspects instead of the hard, case studies to give you examples of certain languages and why they're easier, and a few tips and tricks to make sure you keep on track, and then hopefully have time for questions. So what holds us back is the fear of the unknown and the foreign. That, like, as humans, we tend to see things that are unfamiliar and have a certain amount of fear with that. And because we don't understand, especially when you hear the language the first time, we naturally think it must be hard because it just sounds like gobbledygook, just noise that's coming at me. But your target language is not as foreign as you think. When you first listen to it, it's very easy to just hear this is completely different. There is absolutely no common ground here. This is not true. There are language families that, of course, branched off from one another, whatever, 1,000 or so years ago. And because of that, they do have a lot of commonalities. There are cognates between those. And of course, there are loan words. So if you're a native English speaker, a lot of words from English get borrowed into your target language. This is the case no matter what language you're learning. Even a language like Mandarin has borrowed words like cafe for coffee, and you can take a small number, obviously a much smaller number for more distant languages, but you can rely on this, which means it is literally impossible to start a new language from zero. It's just not possible. You already know something. So that's kind of a mentality I want you to take with you. And of course, in English, we have lots of borrowed words from other languages, which is why they tend to be common. And then there are terms related to pop culture, the names of apps and things we might use like Netflix and products, brand names. A lot of these tend to be similar. So that gives you an initial kickoff point you can work with. And then another reason people might think languages are hard are the grammar, the tones, if you're learning a lot of Asian languages, the writing system, conjugation of verbs, plurals that don't work as consistently as you would hope, some kind of genders in the language, case agreement. So these are things that people give as reasons why the language is hard. And these are things you eventually do need to work on. But I would argue that they're not something that should be holding you back right now. It's mostly the personal blocks that we need to push through. So you think you don't have what it takes. You don't have a natural talent in the language, or maybe you don't have the time. Well, you can make the time. And like, I know that a lot of people who tell me they're too busy will kind of wind their day down with some Netflix, or maybe going through Instagram or TikTok, swiping on their phone. And these are things that you could take that little time slot and make the sacrifice. I don't know if it's something that's sustainable in the long term, but maybe over a period of a few months, you can decide, I am going to sacrifice these things that I typically use to relax and focus on learning the language. And you can even convert one thing to another. I have made separate TikTok accounts and separate Instagram accounts and separate Twitter accounts for my target languages. So even when I'm doing something that's typically wasteful, like social media, I'm actually doing it in the target language. For the last few months before coming to Brazil, I used TikTok a lot in Portuguese. I trained the algorithm. First, I searched for hashtags related to Portuguese. And when I saw other hashtags Brazilians were using, I made sure to follow those. And then anytime the app showed me anything in English, I would hold the screen and say, not interested. And I trained it. And now whenever I entered that version, that account, I only see things in Portuguese. And that meant I was on top of trends. So now that I've arrived in Brazil, I know a lot of the music that is going to be in nightclubs. And I know a lot of kind of running jokes and what's in people's minds right now. So these are things that you would take the time potentially that you would have wasted anyway on an app like TikTok. And if I'm winding down my day with TikTok, I'll wind it down in Portuguese. So you can find ways to make time. Another thing we all get bogged down with is I need to find that perfect method to learn the language. And I think this obsession with perfectionism is another thing that holds people back. You're never going to find the perfect approach. There is no one book that's going to solve all your problems, or one app, or even 3 apps that are going to solve all your language learning problems. You just have to live through the language, whether that be communicating with people online, or things like I said, using multiple different apps that you would use anyway, or changing the language on Netflix. But like ideally, if you can interact with actual humans, that's the best thing. And living the language will make it a necessity in your life. And that's what's going to change things. And maybe you don't have the patience. And I know that when I initially tried to get into language learning, a big mistake I made was I said, I want to learn Spanish. And that was it. That was the only thing I came up with. And I lost patience very quickly because there was no specificity to it. So you have to have patience to do it over the long term. You need to create real goals and create daily habits. And this will make it a lot easier to keep up consistently. A lot of people say I don't have the natural talent or the genes to learn a language. This is quite ridiculous because over half the planet is multilingual, and that has nothing to do with their skin color or anything else like that. It's just the environments that they are in kind of pushes them towards being multilingual. So don't use that excuse about genes. Somebody in your ancestry likely spoke more than one language. So if you're saying, oh, my genetics, I just don't have natural talents because I was born with the wrong genes, absolute nonsense. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. So if you haven't learned the language before, I would argue actually you have your mother tongue. And that's something that can give you an edge. And when children are learning, take inspiration from them. They would say things like, I speaked instead of I spoke. And I would encourage you to make mistakes. A childlike attitude to language learning where I'm just going to speak, I'm going to make mistakes. That is what gives you that edge. If you kind of push away from perfectionism, as I said. Another reason people give that they can't get into it is I've spent so many years learning and I still can't speak. So like part of this is in one way thinking about like how are you measuring your time. Like I studied German in school and in secondary school for 5 years, but I didn't really spend 5 years on German. I spent an hour once a week in a classroom where my teacher was talking at me, usually in English, about German grammar. That's not really 5 years of German, is it? If you added up the hours, let's say it was, I don't know, 300 hours or something. Even then, it's 300 pretty crappy hours that I was not using a very good approach. So I don't like to measure my language learning in years. I like to measure it in effective hours. Hours I'm doing something really useful. And then, of course, if you let go of that perfectionism and just decide, forget how many years I've been learning already. I'm just going to start speaking right now, regardless of how bad my level is. And that's kind of going to give you loads of momentum. If you've already done that, maybe you're struggling through a learning plateau And in that case, change your approach. If what, like the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Begin, I have to change my approach. And all the stuff I say about, like, don't worry too much about grammar at the beginning levels. At the intermediate levels, then I start actually picking up traditional grammar books and studying them. I completely changed my method, and that's how I start to push past those plateaus. And then, of course, your mindset is what makes a language hard. So maybe your personal context, like there are obstacles that you have in your life that change things. Just don't overthink it at the start. You just got to get going, and you will be surprised how much progress you can make. And a lot of people tend to compare like side by side. Here's a list of the differences between my target language and the language that I already know. All languages have complications, no matter what language I've taken on. And because I do it publicly, I get a lot of people replying to me and saying, oh, this is the hardest language in the world because of this and this and this and this. But like, not a lot of people realize that they can they can put the effort in to figure out why a language is easy. I would challenge you to stop thinking about all the reasons it's hard. Why is your target language easy? This is going to help change your mindset. Like in comparison with English, whenever I'm learning a different language, I imagine, well, English is kind of ridiculous. Like the OUGH rules with spelling have absolutely no consistency. When you're creating new words, they're very illogical based on how you put them together. You have weird conjugations on some of the verbs. But when you're doing this with other languages and comparing them, English is actually not that logical. Your passion is the next thing that makes a big difference in how you're learning a language. You've got to be passionate about it and be positive and have a good mindset. And if you focus on the positive, then you'll see what is easy about your target language. So here's a bunch of examples of why certain languages are easier. Spanish is easy because the plural follows very strict rules. Unlike goose and geese, you don't really have these kinds of examples in Spanish, mouse and mice. The pronouns can be left out. The I want, you can actually leave out the I in that. So sentences flow a lot nicer. It's completely phonetic. There are pretty much no exceptions to when you see something spelled out, you know how it's going to be pronounced. This is not the case in English. So a few things to keep in mind there. French can be easier because French and English share a huge history, and there are so many words. These words also help you with other Romance languages, but they tend to be spelt the exact same when it comes to comparing English and French. So the out loud pronunciation can seem a little tricky, but again, French is pretty consistent in its phonetic rules. So you can learn to speak it very quickly based on that. And it's not that far if you speak English. You make a few adjustments. There's loads of words you already know that, like I said, the loan words issue. Conjugation is not as hard as you might think. You make a few minor adjustments. Don't get bogged down with the details of the really complicated tables. Just learn what you need to know right now, and it gets repetitive, and whatever you've learned now will help you for thousands of verbs later. And then tenses and things like the subjunctive don't get as complicated as they may be in other languages. And German is easier than you think because German and English are the same language family. So that gives you a lot of common groundwork, a lot of things like phrasal verbs that have a lot of overlap between how the two languages work. It's a very logical way of forming new vocabulary. And the kind of typical long words in German, I actually like those because in a way, the definition of the word is inside of it. So when you see a new word in German, as long as you have a base level of vocabulary, you can recognize it, even if it's the first time in your life that you've ever seen that word. This is harder in a lot of other languages. So I use this to my advantage. And I try to learn a couple of the kind of prefixes, suffixes, and the cores of words. And this is instantly going to exponentially improve my vocabulary abilities. Something like Korean is easier than you think because the alphabet is one of the most logical in the world. And of course, it's a phonetic language. And it has word families that can help you with vocabulary that are kind of built into the core structure of the words in logical ways. There are no tones, which makes it stand out from potentially other Asian languages as easier, like, for instance, Mandarin. And a lot of words used in Korean are actually loan words in English, especially from pop culture. Japanese is easier than you think. It's because it's got no noun genders and conjugation. You don't have to have the words to agree with the subject. You can omit the subject and object from a lot of sentences if it's clear, and this makes for a lot shorter sentences in some situations. Many Japanese sounds can be found in English. If you already speak Spanish, you would almost instantly know all of Japanese pronunciation because it's got that very similar, very basic vowel structure. So much, much easier than you might think. The syllables only have one possible pronunciation. And then, of course, Mandarin can even be a lot easier than you think. The tones aren't that terrible if you put a little bit of work up front into it. People say, oh, I'm tone deaf. Ridiculous. You're not tone deaf. If you're not tone deaf in the sense that it matters in language learning. Even if you can't sing, if you recognize the difference between you know and you know, that in English is implementing tones to express a certain difference of either emotion or whether you're asking a question. This is still impacted in Mandarin, and we effectively have all of the tones in Mandarin in English. They already exist. They're just used in different ways. So you kind of transfer that into how it would work into the other languages. Practicing with native speakers is a lot easier to think because there's so many Chinese in so many places that you can find them and practice in person without even having to travel. Word formation is very, very logical. That when you see new words, again, similar to German, it's built up upon a logical base of how you're going to, like a tool will say what it's doing to what. And this makes it a lot easier when you see new words. So I always think that vocabulary isn't just a sense of like there's so many new words to learn. It's like, what is easy about vocabulary? That the brand new words are based on sometimes words you've already learned. And of course, it has a simpler vocabulary in a lot of sense. You don't have the same complexities for a lot of the more deeper vocabulary than we might have in some European languages. I would actually argue that it's an easy language with the right mindset. Characters are, of course, a challenge, but that does not change the fact that Mandarin is an easy language. The spoken form has very simple grammar, and if you put learning the characters just to one side, you can learn to speak Mandarin relatively quickly, and then you can get to learning the characters as its own separate challenge. But like I said earlier, try to think of this like a child would, and a child would dive into speaking as soon as possible. So start with learning all that you really need. Like, you don't have to learn specific grammar rules that they're not going to help you right now. I put the grammar off till later. It's more important that when you're starting, you start with vocabulary. So like, why are you learning the language? Try to think of how you would express that. Imagine what you want to talk about, your hobbies, some general vocabulary. And then you can also help the conversation flow a little bit with conversation fillers and connectors. Words like, well, anyway, I guess, and connectors are like, oh, thanks for asking. I would just like throw that in so that I'm not just saying a single yes or no, and things flow a bit better. And what about you, to turn the question back to them. And what I mean is, whenever you're trying to think of a word to say, and then of course using booster verbs in a lot of languages means you can temporarily postpone learning conjugations of more complicated words. So like, as an example, in German, you can use ich muss just to kind of put the next verb after that. In Italian, voglio, just I want, and then put the infinitive, the dictionary form after that. Even if the meaning changes a lot, I would use these kind of booster verbs to give me, or modal verbs to give me that extra stuff that I can work on. I would also prepare conversation scripts ahead of time, because a lot of our conversations as beginners are really predictable. So we can decide what I want to say. If I'm introducing myself, I know I'm going to talk about my story a little bit, why I'm learning the language, my travels. That conversation is going to happen pretty consistently if I'm meeting new people. So it's not completely unpredictable, and I can learn a few phrases ahead of time that are going to help me with that. But ultimately, I want you to take from this that languages are a means of communication. Don't think of them like an academic subject. A language should be lived rather than learned. And once you have that mindset, it can change everything dramatically. So I hope I've gone through enough stuff there that I have time for a few questions from people. You'll have to pass them on to me because I can't read them myself.
Okay, thank you very much, Benny. Do we have one or two quick questions for Benny? Because for Derek.
Thanks, Benny. That was really inspiring. Going through all the reasons why languages are not as difficult as we think they are. In the UK, we're in an environment where the government has decided that languages are not important. Up to the age of 14, they're compulsory, but beyond 14, they're not in education. That sends a signal to people that language